So first of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to come back again for a second round of conferencing in Petrovac. I'm very sorry and sad that I wasn't able to join you physically this year, but I have been listening to all the presentations for the now days as much as I could. And I must say it was a truly inspiring 2 days. And I do assume that all of you present there are rather tired by now. So I'm gonna try to keep it sort of short and sweet and just give a small example of how a whole trail was passed from not doing digital to becoming digital for dealing with narratives in museums and collections, and then somehow coming a full circle back to the physical space again. So my title of my presentation, as Milena said, is Queering the Collections, Histories and Digital Realm, let's say it like that. So searching for something that is in English more termed as an alternative history. In Serbo-Croatian, it's kind of a bit of a charged term to build an alternative history, so it's maybe good that I'm using English now. And started already 30 years ago. And it's something that's heavily rooted in post-colonial theory, and trying to find the roots of the collections that we have in our museums and telling narratives that are not there. And I think the first big or the most important exhibition that sort of started the movement is called Mining the Museum. And it was staged in the Historical Society of Maryland by Fred Wilson. I suppose many of you know who he is. He is an artist. And he was invited to sort of dig through the collection of the Historical Society and their permanent display, and to search for objects that can tell a different story of the Civil War. And what is important to say, of course, that he did use all the objects from the museum itself, but many of them, especially the more problematic ones, never actually put within the catalog of the institution. And so you can see he was kind of building couples of objects that are kind of normal everyday use, such as a cradle, and then he placed a whole costume of Ku Klux Klan within the cradle. So he was playing heavily on the bringing together of the official narrative of the American Civil War and the slavery going in the background of the whole process, or being the main source and reason for the start of the Civil War. And he had, of course, several striking comparisons that he took out from the collection. And as you can see, here is the second picture, shows sort of the introduction he gave to his exhibition. And I think the maybe most important question in this context is, from whom was it created and for whom does it exist? And this is somehow, I think, the lines that many museums afterwards, especially the ethnographic ones, took into consideration in dealing with their collections and what they have in store somehow. Because I'm somehow going to come back to the talk of Dutch context and Holland. We are going to go now to examples of re-questioning of Dutch slavery and colonial history. And a very good example that was once upon a time in 2002 formed was the NINSE, or the Institute for Research of Slavery. Their main goal was to sort of do research and somehow present the history of slavery in Holland. They were an NGO, but heavily funded by the state at that point. And that somehow coming sort of to the peak of being democratic and inclusive for the narratives that are not that light or that pretty. And they worked a lot with schools, with other cultural institutions, and with the non-governmental sector. And I think maybe the most successful project that they had in the period of 10 years while they were open and running was the so-called alternative canal route in Amsterdam. For those who have visited Amsterdam, you know that there are the boat tours that you can kind of take. So they built an alternative one, visiting the beautiful villas on the canals, and telling the story of the owners and actually their slave trade business. So that was somehow something that took, I think, for the whole 10 years, they were able to kind of do the tour. Of course, with the sort of the rise of the economic crisis again, and then it's sort of effects in 2012. And of course, with the extreme right-wing direction the Dutch government somehow took within these years. First, in 2012, they lost their state subsidies. And then they lost their space, exhibition space and working space. And only several years later, I think in 2016, they lost almost all the funding from the gemeente of Amsterdam or from the city council of Amsterdam. So they basically had to stop working in a physical sense. And that's something that was kind of really noticeable in the year 2012 with the dealing with problematic past in museums, and museums trying, or institutions trying to be really direct in re-questioning. And the second, and maybe my favorite example, because I'm sort of personally connected to the topic and I worked on the exhibition, was the exhibition Encounters in the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. For you that haven't seen the museum, it's actually, the proper name was the Dutch Royal Colonial Museum. So it is kind of a museum collecting objects from all the colonies that once upon a time belonged to Holland and somehow do belong still today. And somehow the department, the curatorial department, decided that they want to, for the first time, do an exhibition that is not going to take any objects that are on a loan or anything, and they're only going to use their own material and try to give somehow an institutional statement, so not an artistic one, about the colonial past they belong to and they are kind of rooted in. So they built a beautiful exhibition called Encounters, where they were encountering problematic and less problematic objects from the museum collection. And this is maybe my most favorite pair. And I can, if anybody wants to know what it is, I can explain a bit later, because I don't want to waste too much time for other people that need to go to different places after this. And they tried to do it. It was staged for a full year, but somehow the effect of doing an exhibition of this type in a physical space was that museum was practically closed down afterwards. So it physically still has the building and its collection, but it's not anymore, let's say, an independent institution. Now it belongs to the like National Dutch Ethnographic Collections or World Cultures Museums, and it doesn't operate anymore with a strong focus on the colonial past it has. So somehow the institution was left completely unquestioned in a sense. So that all happened in 2013, and that's somehow as well sort of a benchmark here of a full-blown appearance of digital tools that are used by the museums. And maybe, well, 2 years before that, the Rijksstudio is I think, a biggest digitalized collection of objects in Europe, at least, was finally done, and they digitalized almost the whole collection they have. So they made it available online, and somehow museums recognized that maybe the digital can be a solution, that we can open certain narratives and talk about them and get maybe a better support, or it would be a less of a risk for institution and the curatorial staff not to actually do it in the physical space. So somehow in between 2015 and 2023 already now, we can see a high rise of the size and number and the quality of digitalized material that are, some of them are free for the user, some of them you need to pay, all around the world. Then we can notice that museums are heavily using the GIS softwares or geographic information systems for building the maps and connections between their collections of different museums of similar types. And they heavily use it for presentation as well, because you can, I think every year you have at least 10 designs that go with building a little network of things, and that's how we operate. Then, somehow it was noticed that with the digital, actually museums can maybe follow up with the idea of democratization of knowledge and actually achieving full participation, because it doesn't demand physical interaction in a way, and it doesn't demand physical collecting as well. So kind of the digital space and the solution became the realm of participation. And somehow this definitely, the whole idea of building the digital realm that are not necessarily only virtual museums, but actually networks of institutions, were sort of a new format within which maybe the highest level of benefit was sort of provided for digital users. So not anymore to your primary stakeholders as they were once defined, so people surrounding your institution physically, but people sort of engaging with you, your ideas and your collections from a distance. And I'm just gonna give a quick couple of examples of maybe my favorite museum collection networks that were built on this principle. So we have the Inclusive Museum Network that was started in 2008, and it sort of brings together all the institutions that want to work on social inclusion, cultural diversity, or participation. Even though most of their sort of members are institutions from Southeast Asia, they still do operate internationally, like truly internationally, and they are kind of the forerunner of academic research on this topic. Second, and maybe the most fun one, unfortunately, the presentation is too static for us to try it out, is the History Pin platform. That is actually a platform that brings together, I think, more than 1,000 collecting institutions, and then sort of the hobby or highly professional hobbyists interested in history, where they can build their own collections and search and link between every other digital object is available online. And I just chose this one that is mapping the magic, because you can see that you have everything integrated within it. Many software solutions are there for you to build sort of the map and the unseen layers of connection between different parts of the world. Third, definitely is the We Are Museums platform that went fully digital in 2020 during the pandemic, and actually did produce a lot of high quality content from museum professionals. But one really important thing about them is that the members of this community were actually really vocal and really active in providing the new museum definition that was adopted in 2022, end of the year, I think. So it's kind of the second way of how can we professionally work together and build a platform that's not anymore based only on physical presence. And finally, the project that's starting, or actually it already started, I think, in February of this year. It's called Escape, and I think it's the biggest project of its kind, or building a network of institutions working digitally together, because it brings together more than 500 institutions of the GLAM realm. It's based in UK, and for those of you that are not familiar, the GLAMs are actually galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, EA, all the collecting institutions within UK, and they built a project actually focused on the idea of the new green movement, let's say it like that, but somehow focused more on the wildlife. And what they're doing, they're going to have a whole 2-year project of 500 institutions working together and building programs for children, especially focused on ecology and extinction of animal species. And they have full-blown participation, of course, available as well, because that's UK and they started it sort of first, doing it in that way. So somehow it's, I think, the final example I would give now, because it's just the one that I like. And now we are coming back to the actual topic that I wanted to talk about, and to the project called Queering the Museum. And why I selected this one especially is because it started as a digital project, and as well as a project that will sort of bring together professionals and interested communities as well into building alternative or less seen narratives in the museum space. And this project started in 2012. I mean, it was, I think, only a 4-year project, so it's not running anymore, but it had a lot of products that came from it. And it was sort of focused on, building a method and a way how can we present the LGBTQ plus narratives within museum collections, because they're still somehow, those narratives are still lacking within the museum space heavily, both physically and digitally. And for them, this was kind of a way of, let's now build an international or a global network within which we will develop sort of a method within which you can queer your collection. Of course, they used a lot of digital tools for doing this. So you had from QR codes that tell a different narrative when you go to a museum or you walk around the city, and you can get the pieces of the LGBTQ plus history within it, to actually somehow using making physical interventions in museum spaces. So for example, after this project, there was a whole movement of building gender neutral toilets in museum spaces or within institutions that took part of the queering the museum or queering the collections project. Maybe the most important thing is this, and it's written here, the Gender and Sexuality Inclusion Toolkit for Museums, Heritage and Cultural Institutions. That is a toolkit that is, a digital toolkit, and it's as well based on how to do things digitally. But a good quality of it is it's continuously being sort of added on and built upon. So it's not like one set of tools, but many different ideas that you had and you tried and you wanted to test and they worked. You can bring them within this little toolkit that then can be used for any and every institution that finds this topic interesting. 3 years later, than start of this project, the queering of the museum came to Holland, and they called it in Holland, they called it Queering the Collections Network. And that's, I think, the first really important part of the change of this manual, in a way, is that they decided that they will not queer only museum collections, but any type of a collection. So they heavily worked with archives and libraries as well in building this, or in additionally building this toolkit and applying it afterwards. And the main project group was based from a Museum of Contemporary Art, which is Museum Van Abbe in Eindhoven, then Amsterdam or Dutch LGBTQ Heritage Forum, or IHLIA, then the Rijnvaart Academy, and the City Museum of Amsterdam. And what they did, they first started with the project of bringing in the narratives within the physical space of the museum. And then they realized that this is not good enough and that they have to try and go digital. So they created the baseline publication, or the small manual for Dutch museums and cultural institutions in doing the queering of the collections. Afterwards, they sort of started building the new queer collection of the Van Abbe Museum, or better said, the new queer interpretation of the Van Abbe Museum collection. And that somehow had sort of a resonance that was not minor, but major either. So they were able to sort of bring in the source community, let's call it like that, and bring them inside of the museum for collaboration and working on the project. But somehow the project slowly dies down, and it's not something that made a permanent mark on the Van Abbe Museum, besides of building a gender neutral toilets in the museum. And in their digital presence, you have to know where it is to sort of even hear about it within their digital presentation. Nevertheless, what makes this in a way project or the interpretation of creating museums special is that by using the digital tools, they were able to sort of broaden the collection type they want to use, and they were able to create connections that are otherwise difficult to make within the physical space. So they are not impossible, but they are complicated. Secondly, they kind of recognize that the idea of queering, or the queering method, can actually be used for talking about problematic narratives as such. So not necessarily only for talking about the history and heritage of LGBTQ plus population in Holland, but that they can somehow rephrase it and build it bigger, so they can incorporate the new narratives that they want to tell. But they're, of course, they are not new, but they are problematic, and in a general public in Holland, not really popular to talk about colonial past, instead of talking about the Dutch Golden Age. So they started using this method to describe and incorporate different formats of marginalized narratives. And this finally results in the, hopefully this year, opening of the new building of the Amsterdam City Museum and the new permanent exhibition they will build. Because they are closed down, of course, their presence right now is mainly digital, and they develop a lot of things digitally, but are constantly thinking of how can we bring this back now to our museum space. So in terms of, like bringing the queering, they of course have the queer gaze tours now within the museum itself, and of course within the city of Amsterdam, because Amsterdam City Museum actually provides a lot of guided tours through the city itself. So they have sort of the interested members of the source community taking the streets of Amsterdam or taking the museum and talking about, giving the alternative narrative to the official narrative that you can read on the building. Of course, they somehow it's not really strange that they were able to do that in the city of Amsterdam, especially having in mind the level and the size of the Pride Month in Holland in general, but in Amsterdam especially. So it was not that difficult to find a source community or to even define your target audience, and for this project to actually work out really well. But what they did, and this is where I will sort of close down my presentation, is that they started building the new collection narratives programs. And they started first with the digital. So they started using the tool of significance 2.0 combined, and that's kind of a model, Australian model for describing museum objects. And combining it with the querying method, and they started building new narratives around the objects they have in their museums as somehow the process that will be needed when the museum finally opens its door to the public again. The second thing that they started doing is that they decided that their museum will sort of follow the new narratives principle, and both in the way they will create and build the exhibition, and both in the way they will approach the guided tours that will have to be changed. I think twice per month, they will have to sort of switch the person telling the story and change the narrative that will be given. And of course, for that, they will heavily use digital means, because you cannot print that many labels in a year. And they finally opened a whole podcast that actually has a lot of followers, and it's well received of different people, different stakeholders telling their new narrative, connecting to the object from the Amsterdam City Museum. So somehow the whole idea that in a way closed down the Tropen Museum 10 years ago is now gonna live its full renaissance within the new Amsterdam City Museum. And thank you. I will stop here because, yeah, my mom killed my presentation yesterday. So it's not anymore operating in a way that I sort of wanted it to. So I will stop the sharing. Yeah, and I'm here for any questions you might have. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Marija, so much. For me, it is really interesting actually to, during your presentation, I was so much thinking about actually the SMART method. In a sense, it is actually completely following the history of museology and the categorization of objects, and they're actually, like from the cabinets of wonders, they're actually exposition in different, making your mind wander through different objects which are completely opposite somehow and in illogical constellations, and actually making your body also somehow walk through that collection and try to understand the relationships. So you greatly somehow started from the Wilson's intervention, which are following the same sense, and just the new interpretations, the new valorizations are just somehow being more extended to the digital world, but actually smartly using actually the method which we already knew from centuries now, which is great because somehow the visitor is not entering in one completely other museum, which would be the Gender Museum or the Museum of Other, but actually entering into the traditional museum collection and issuing it, issuing the categorization. We were speaking a lot about library as a community spot, museum as a community spot these days, and this is somehow completely opening new spaces and new perspectives for the interpretation. So thank you so much, but I will shut up now because I'm sure that there are some comments or questions from the audience. We have one question here, but we're waiting for the mic.
Hello, fantastic presentation. I hope you enjoyed myself. My question is regarding the encounters collection, the one about the colonialism.
I can hear you, so maybe you can switch to our language, because then I catch it better in a way.
Down closer to the microphone. Can you hear me now better?
I can. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So my question is regarding the encounters collection, the one about the colonialism. As you said that the Dutch glorify the Golden Dutch Age, was there a specific reason why the collection did not last longer, but was disinformed in 2013?
Okay, so I probably wasn't clear enough. So the Encounters exhibition is one exhibition that was made by Tropen Museum, and Tropen Museum is at least 3 centuries old, in a sense. The collection itself, it is really old, and they kept it as a colonial museum with the name Colonial Museum until 2013. And this exhibition sort of was the last and final attempt of the institution to actually take a political stand towards their own past, or its own past, you know, so to say, okay, we are part of the colonial narrative. This is not the golden age. This is something connected, deeply connected to slavery from one side, and to the physical anthropology, and later on racism that appeared in Europe in a full-blown, well, in the US as well. But somehow they try to talk about the problematics of being an institution of that type and having to survive within the new political correct systems, where we sort of recognize it, but we really don't want to talk about it, you know?
And since 2013, have there been attempts to reignite the collection?
The collection is still there, but what they do now as a space, you know, and as an exhibition space, more than as a museum, is that they invite a lot of contemporary artists, because that was as well one method that they tried sort of from the 80s, let's say it like that, to build the contemporary art collections from the regions they took ethnographic objects from. So they were collecting contemporary art from their former colonies. So they started inviting contemporary artists to give their sort of interpretation of the narrative this collection carries. And I mean, in a way, I need to make a point in that sense, because that's, I think, the sort of easy way out from the issue, you know, like you bring an artist, they have their artistic freedom, they can do whatever they want, and there is a freedom of speech, and then you as an institution are not really allowed to do the same. And somehow it just became a new exhibition space. I mean, it's a beautiful building with a beautiful old permanent collection, if you want to look at something like that. But, you know, like it's a profoundly problematic place, let's say it like that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your answer.